categories of qualitative research. On the one hand, there will be MC Lai from Kantar, and the other will be Sophie Cox from Firestar. Now, please ask your questions or submit questions on the chat function so that we'll be able to answer those as we go along. So let me introduce now Sophie Fox, who will lead this session. Sophie, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Hi, MC.
Hey, Sophie. Thanks, John.
So the first thing that we'd like to do, because there is a little bit of a delay between the chat, we'd like to ask all you as our viewers to do something that we call a chat storm, which is we're going to give you 10 or 15 seconds, and we just want you to type into the chat the first thing that comes to your mind when we think about qual research. So just no right or wrong, just type 3 or 4 words into the chat, go. So, and while we are waiting for that to come through at our end, we'll just maybe give you a very, very quick 10-second intro. So MC, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So hi, everybody. In fact, hi, friends. So I see a lot of people that, we have known each other for a while. It's good to be able to sort of have this session. So for those who don't know me, I lead the Kantar Malaysia office. So I'm the CEO, and I am still a qual at heart. So I've been doing qualitative research, for the past 20 years or so. Even today, as I manage the business, I think that really helps in terms of providing context, because it's all about human understanding, right? So whether you're managing a business, whether you're looking at the business issues and all that, qualitative definitely helps in terms of shaping as well as giving us insights. So yes, so that's a bit about me. And Sophie, what about you?
Thanks. So I am originally from the UK. I've lived in Malaysia for nearly 20 years, and I run a company which is a pure qual company called Firestar. So we only really do qualitative research. I'm very passionate about qualitative research. We've got some really good answers coming in, really interesting answers coming in on the chat. I'm just going to call out a few random ones. So personal, observe, underrated. Yes, thank you, KN. We like that one. Less numbers, survey, lots of talking and conversation, requires experience, time consuming. That's interesting. Human emotions and feelings. Yes, we like that as well. The why. I think often when we think of qual, sometimes the first thing that comes to our mind is the methodologies that we use. And that's coming out in the chat as well. So several people have mentioned focus groups and in-depth interviews and interviews. So perhaps we can think a little bit more, as this session is intended to demonstrate, what is the role of qualitative? What's your opinion on that, MC?
So certainly, as what people have been saying, as a methodology, we always sort of think of qual and quant very separate. But if you really think about it, after all, it is about just understanding human and getting insights, right? So while qual plays a very important role, and the role is not just about understanding the why. In fact, there's a lot of behavioral data, as what we have heard from the earlier speaker, whether it's from social, whether it's from other sort of aspect. I think what we need to think about is the way that we collect data, even in qual, have changed. So the point about it takes time. Yes, it does take time to recruit, maybe to find the right people. But I think the turnaround time nowadays for qual is also a lot faster and a lot more agile. So just as what our quant peers have sort of evolved over the past 12 months, I think qualitatively we have also changed. Right, the whole community now is online. Nobody would have thought of doing qual online, in January 2020. People would have said, nah, that's not going to work. People are not going to come to online. But guess what, guys? We've been doing 99% of our qual now online. So I think we need to start with ourselves with a very open mind in terms of what qual would bring, and ultimately remember that qual is about understanding consumers, understanding human behavior. Right, so I think forget about methodology per se, but really think about what is the benefit and the outcome that qual could bring. Yeah. What about you, Sophie?
Yeah, I think for me that there's a few things that qualitative can help with. I was really interested that Anwar mentioned in his presentation earlier that consumers are changing fast, and I think consumer behavior is changing because of the culture and the world in which they live. So now we have access to technology, we have other things going on, but I wonder whether consumers at their core are really changing that much. I think mums still want to be the best mum that they can be. I think that we still value our family connections. That there's some quite fundamental things that are much slower to change. And I think qualitative is very useful at that intersection between behaviors and beliefs. And sometimes when we just look at what I might call hard data, so numbers, it captures that moment in time, but it doesn't give us that depth of understanding of what's really going on in people's lives. And qualitative gives us the value to dig deep and to get down into those, how people live and why they do the things that they do.
Yeah, I certainly agree. In fact, I think Owen showed a bunch of data in terms of the badminton fans, right? So I think in my mind, it was more of why would they do this, or what's driving them to do that? So I think intuitively, right, everybody would have had the question on, that's interesting, I wonder why. Or can I find out more in terms of how do I then engage them? So I think, without really thinking aloud, everybody is thinking about qual, right? So it's just, like I said, as a methodology, people have different opinion of qual, but the way that you think about things, the way that you always ask questions, that is part of what qualitative is all about, and that's how qual will provide the answers. But again, given the current time that we're in, things that we do or the approach that we take in qual needs to evolve, right? So it's no longer the traditional, focus group, not your traditional IDI and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more different technology that we can leverage now, right? So a good example of things like that. So even ethnography is now done online. And I think recently we did a project where we actually found that with technology, it really helps to, in fact, remove some of the barrier, because you don't have to be at someone's house, sort of breathing down their neck and looking at what they cook, right? So it's a video that they take themselves, they kind of talk to themselves and so on. So those are the kind of things that I feel with technology, it's really helping us to, get into the minds of consumer a lot better and faster. Do you agree with that, Sophie? Any other example?
I do. I think that there is a need. I think that when we think about how qualitative research is evolving, it's important that we don't just try and take what we've done offline and put it online, because I really think that doesn't work and it's not a great approach. And I think that we need to be thinking creatively about how we can manage that. And for me, one of the greatest opportunities in qualitative is that if we have skilled practitioners, that we use our skills as practitioners to ask the right questions at the right time, to make that human connection. We have the capacity to understand when people are being truthful with us, to manage them through nonverbal cues. And when we do online qual, we have to figure out how to incorporate that as well, and how to bring some of those skills that we have into the new age.
Yeah, I agree. And I think to set the context as well, right? A lot of times in the past, we kind of need to jump into a focus group or a study to understand basic about consumer. Whereas now, I think there's a lot more that we could leverage on non-survey data that, it can help us to sort of build hypotheses, help us to understand consumer before we then go into an actual project and then validate those. So I think, leveraging things like social analytics, looking at, consumer data itself, working with clients, to already analyze what we have from a consumer data perspective. I think these are things that, 5 years ago, nobody would have really thought about in qual. So, and I think right now, there's a lot more collaboration or integration between qual and quant as well. I don't know, that's something that you see. So no longer, I think, when we think about a client's business problem, we think about qual, we think about quant. We think about how do we solve the problem? What do we need? What is the right thing to bring on board and so on. So again, removing methodology or departments is something that I keep on driving, because ultimately we are working together as a consumer insights team. So yeah, so I think even the quant guys nowadays are very well versed and well briefed into qual as well. So I think that helps.
Let's take an example maybe of how marketing has changed and how qual can integrate. So we see a lot of clients at the moment are focusing on things like CX and customer journeys. So at Kantar, do you have any specific product or formula that helps agree with that helps clients understand that? How would you approach something like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think everybody would probably have their own, I guess, solutions or tools to it. But I think the philosophy behind it, a consumer journey, it's very much about understanding consumer. So it is very much ingrained in the way that we think about consumer in qual. But what's interesting for me is a lot of times when we speak to client, a lot of clients will say, actually, I do have a consumer journey mapping, and then they bring it out, and you kind of think about it and say, I think that's more of your organization mapping in terms of departments. That may not necessarily be how consumer think about it or how consumer go through your journey. So I think thinking from different perspective is important. So not always sort of think about this is how my organization is all about. I think one of the chat earlier, I think Suk Mei from Hong Leong Bank brought out a good example where bringing the branch manager, I think, to the B40s to sort of open up their eyes and say, okay, this is how my customer live and breathe. So I think things like that, giving them a different perspective, then they will understand in terms of how to engage the consumer better, how to provide better consumer experience and so on. So I think, yeah, at Kantar, we definitely think a lot in terms of, consumer experience, and think about how, integrating customer experience and brand experience, because that two needs to come together. In fact, there's one more element now, it's called the employee experience. So it's a triangular relationship. And I think to us, that's the three things that's very important to make a total experience work.
I completely agree. I do think that one of the areas that qualitative can really add value is when we do sometimes see that processes within organizations are created inside out. So they are often for the benefit of the organization. And it is really important to remember that we are serving someone. That's what CX and HX are all about. So ensuring that we have the consumer at the heart of everything, and we are not adding more friction. We are removing the friction and removing the pain points. And I do feel that sometimes when we look at quantitative data or data or analytics data, we sometimes can see something is happening, but we don't understand what the friction is. So we can see, for example, if we look at web traffic, we can see how people are moving around the site or the app and what they're doing. There may be a sudden drop off on one page, but we don't understand why. And we can't really fix that problem until we've figured out what's going on. So there's lots and lots of opportunities to use qual and to really get to the heart of understanding the motivations and the barriers towards consumer behavior. And I do feel that sometimes understanding things that consumers don't do or things that they nearly did is actually where the richness of the insights can come from. And that is also something that we are not going to get necessarily from quant data, where we tend to look more at actual behavior, or it's actually telling us what people are doing, capturing that moment in time in that sense.
I totally agree. I think from qual, we all understand that actually a lot of nuggets are coming if you read between the line, right? It's not what consumers are saying, it's not what consumers are doing, but rather, the reaction from them or the behavior from them that they don't say, right? So I think those are the things that it is difficult to identify, but once you have that, that's going to differentiate in terms of the brands. But I think beyond that, the other interesting is also what you said is, if we just looked at the data that's available, being Malaysian, we are what we call keyboard warrior, right? We kind of type and talk a lot of complaints. I don't like this, I don't like that. But On the other hand, we don't really compliment or talk a lot about positive stuff, which they are. So if we just look at from a social data perspective, we might be missing a piece that is also just as important. So I think complementing, non-survey data with qualitative data is the way to go. So I think, again, the way that we have been doing things at Kantar is always to look at a holistic picture. So even if you do a quant or a qual or both, we always want to look into social media and other aspect of the non-survey data to give us a better picture. I do have a question for the audience and Sophie as well. So I think there's a lot of myth or misconception about qual that we've heard and talked about. What are some of the sort of key ones that you have heard of, Sophie, and how do we sort of help people to understand that in your perspective?
I think that's a great question. We've got a lot of questions coming in on the chat. I will answer that briefly, and then maybe we'll move on to some of the questions that we have here. For me, certainly one of the questions that we get asked or challenged with most often is the number of people. Oh, but you only spoke to 12 people, or oh, but you've only spoken to 24 people. I'm sure you hear that as well. Yeah. And that's about understanding when to deploy qualitative to me. It's not intended as a validation tool. It doesn't give you that confirmation. It's a developmental tool. It needs to be used at the beginning to understand, to pull out those nuggets of values and behaviors which can then be developed in whatever project you're doing, be it new product development or UX or wherever we're going. So that for me is one of the biggest challenges. Slow, we've also heard, which we've talked about earlier. I think as well that it's something that's not very easy to do self-serve. I know there's a lot of tools out there, but there is quite a lot of talent required. And so we sometimes hear, oh, well, it's just chit chat, or it's yeah. And often when we look into it, it's because it was taken on internally, or someone has tried to do it who maybe didn't have much experience, and then it didn't quite go according to plan.
Yeah, I think, again, it's the mindset, isn't it? That if you think about it as a methodology, then you have all this question about sample size and all that. But if you think of a total picture of business question that you want to get answers from, then it is not about whether you're talking to 24 people or 240 people. It's whether does it answer the question? Is that reach insights that we can then action on to get the growth that we need. So yeah, I agree with that. So we should look at some of the questions, I guess, from the audience.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a question from Barry's actually asked two questions, but I'm just going to pull out one. How do you see the role of chatbots in qualitative research?
I think we have and still continue to sort of evolve the chatbots that we have. It's actually quite a fascinating tool, especially with the I wanted to say millennials, but all of us are young at heart anyways, right? So all of us in this room can definitely relate to the experience with chatbots. And I think eventually once it learns a lot more, it can help, but it still needs a human element, of course, behind it to manage it. So I don't think we can get away from human. If Barry's question is will human replace qual researcher? The answer is no. But I think chatbot helps to perhaps manage a bit better in terms of the text. And I assume technology in maybe a year's time would help us to quickly sort out words and filter out stuff and do the analysis bit a bit faster, maybe.
Yeah, I think anyone who's been on one of those websites, not mentioning any names, where the customer support is a chatbot, might understand why we are nowhere near getting ready for chatbots in qual, especially when so much of the skill of moderation is about understanding how to phrase a question, how to ask the right question, and reading between the lines of the answers as well, and understanding from those answers what we should probe or push and what we should move, how we should move on. Good question though, Barry. Thank you. There's another question here. From Kamal, in MR, there is always a divide between quant and qual. Do you think with new technologies, for example, bulletin boards and online diaries, the line is being blurred? Which side do you think we will lean more towards?
Interesting question, isn't it? So I think my answer is pretty much what I've said earlier is I don't believe in it's either or. So I think depending on the business questions that we're trying to address, it could be both. It could be one better addressed than the other. So I don't really think about it as, which is more relevant in the future. So I think it boils back to what are we trying to answer here? Is it trying to get a perspective on size, visibility, and the degree of it, or are we trying to answer in terms of the why, the white space or the how? Yeah. So I think, yeah.
I tend to agree. I think that going way back, because I'm a bit of a dinosaur these days, that qual and quant were always designed to be complementary. And then somehow we ended up with this either or mentality. And it should come back to the business objectives, not even the research objectives, but the business objectives. What are we hoping? Why are we doing this research? Where are we going? And then from that to understand what's the best way to get there. And it might be one, it might be the other, or it might be a combination of the two. I think my big challenge to the question is that there is a tendency in some markets to try and think, well, if we do enough people in qual, we can just quantify the results anyway. So, if we put 40 people or 50 people on this bulletin board, then we've got enough people to quantify it. And that's a big watch out for me. That is a big concern for me, because in the same way that we kind of traditionally have iced coffee or hot coffee, we think that by combining the two and we get lukewarm coffee, that it's going to be desirable. It's not.
Agree. I mean, nowadays there's so much of agile solution, even in quant, that if you want to test out things, you can get it in 24 hours. So why sort of disturb what qual can bring if you can do it very quickly in a quant study after that, right? So I think. Yeah, and I think that the value that qual can bring in 2021 onwards is even greater, given the pandemic, given the limitation and so on and so forth, where we really need to then understand how consumer behavior has changed, how COVID is impacting various different behavior. I don't know about you, Sophie. Do you think with 2021 coming, just 4 weeks, how would qual sort of add value?
Yeah, I think that there's also a couple of comments in the chat about how qual can be underrated a bit, and how can we push qual. I think it is about helping everyone to understand when to deploy it so that it's used well, it's used at the right time and selectively, so that we help clients to invest budget in the right places. And not use budget erroneously. I think it is important that we continue to develop methodologies that can tie into other real-time data, and that we can also think about how we can speed up qual so that it can be more integral to the faster developing marketing cycles. I think within that, there is still always a place, particularly for consumer-facing brands, to develop the brand on a long-term basis, and qual is very much one's friend there. The other thing I see as exciting and coming up is the use of qual in innovation, and I do think that innovation is going to become quite a big thing in Malaysia, with Malaysian brands, within the next 2 to 3 years. And absolutely, one needs to do innovation, and one needs to use qual in an innovation process, because you can't find those unmet needs and gaps and those real nuggets just through hard data.
Yeah, I agree. And personally, what I'm excited in 2021 and beyond is how can we technologize or digitize qual, right? So I think we have always had the good old argument is qual is very traditional, la la da 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 da. But I think we're at this juncture where we could really take a big leap in using technology. So yeah, I'm very, like I said, personally excited about it, and I'm hoping everybody in this room, have an open mind and really work, together in terms of how we develop qual into the sort of new era.
Yeah, let me see if there's any last questions in the, let me see. The pandemic. A lot of really interesting comments actually in the comment section. Missed this one from earlier. How can qual play a meaningful and necessary role in helping brands to understand consumers' digitalization? So to help brands develop their digitization strategy.
Wow, big question. I guess if I break it down, it's pretty much about understanding consumer adoption or consumer usage of digital. So the way I would then sort of again break it down, it's really to understand the consumer journey, isn't it? Like how have for example Zoom or how has Teams changed the way that you interact with your family members even. So then you start to sort of get them to talk about stories, try to identify pain points, try to identify nuggets that again as a brand that you can leverage and use to engage and connect with consumers. So I think the fundamental have not changed in terms of how we think about the problem, but again, if you try to break it down into consumer journey and sort of mini episodes as we call it, and try to understand what are the various different pain points or opportunities that as a brand I can own or I can connect. So I'm just thinking out loud here. So imagine if Milo sort of owns the Zoom moment, right? So if everybody sort of talk about Zoom and they associate with Milo, that would be perfect, isn't it? So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there for brands now to really think about it.
Yeah, I think that if we agree broadly that because digitization is a journey, I think, internally and externally, and therefore there will be points along that journey where we need to understand either externally how our consumers are on board, what are their pain points. We talked earlier about friction. How can we make things more frictionless? How can we help? And then internally, because we haven't even talked about qual as a tool internally to understand how our employees are coping and how we are doing and how we can get everyone on board with the process. So understanding employee attitudes is also a very valuable deployment of qualitative, I would say, ensuring that internally everyone is aligned, everyone understands the journey and the values in the same way. Externally, yes, about really, and I really liked Sukmay's example, which you gave earlier as well, about taking a load of people on a flight so that everyone really understands what it's like through the whole process of check-in and getting on the flight. And it is very true. Qual has that ability to immerse people in the world of consumers, which is, I think, much more difficult for data to do.
Right. Again, it complements each other. Without the data, then you kind of don't know what priorities are. Where would you put your investment into, right? So yeah. I think, again, the good old argument is not qual or quant. It's really what are we trying to solve? What is the business question we're trying to answer? So I think that's probably what I guess we would sort of leave everybody with as a suggestion into 2021 is really, what the broader, bigger picture is. What are we trying to answer here?
Yeah, there's a question, last question from Callow. I think I know the answer to this anyway, but I'm going to call it out. Should the agencies abandon qual versus quant departments?
If again, the way I think about it, I would say yes, in the sense of the way that you think about the brief or the client's business question, but expertise-wise, I mean, we all know that not everybody can, are good with numbers. Neither is everybody comfortable in, dealing with conversations and sort of a very vague and broad conversation. So from that perspective, I think we still need expertise, but as a, I guess, senior person within an agency, I think very much the practice is not about qual or quant. It's about what is the client's business question we're trying to answer. That's how I look at it. I don't know about you.
Okay, I think that that's covered most of the questions. I'm quite happy to jump into the chat afterwards. Maybe you want to as well, MC, and then we can interact with anyone in there if there's anyone who's still wanting to talk to us. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been a great pleasure.